The Romans were a people you did not want to mess with because they brought the cruelty and the viciousness of the ancient world to the next level. And it's made all the worse by the fact they were a highly capable people, probably the most formidable in the ancient world. Not only were they violent, but they knew how to maximize their violence against their enemies. They wanted to ensure that anyone who challenged the might of Rome suffered tremendously. During Rome's sacking of Jerusalem, a Jewish witness reported how the Romans had, quote, made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched with these men's blood. When Rome was destroying Carthage, they took all the Carthaginian allies, didn't kill them, but cut their hands off, and then let them go. And then for the Carthaginians themselves, well, their entire civilization doesn't even exist anymore. And don't even get me started on Gaul, where the only accurate way you can describe what happened is a Holocaust. The point I'm trying to make here is that when the Romans wanted to do something, they were fully capable of doing it. But just answering the standard call of duty wasn't an option. 100% wasn't enough. The Romans expected nothing less than 1000%. They didn't need to kill so many Jews as to have enough blood to put out fires, or kill 1/3 of the Celtic population. They didn't need to wipe Carthage off the face of the earth. But they did. Every time something was to be done, it was to be done at 1000%. And despite how capable, intelligent, and formidable the Romans were, there was one thing they couldn't do. Control Julius Caesar. And who was the one person on Earth who could? Some Egyptian woman named Cleopatra. And when Caesar was killed, she hooked up with the next most powerful guy in Rome like it was nothing. You won't see this much cynical politicking again until Machiavelli himself. Cleopatra is the first femme fatale any Western audience has ever seen. And for that reason, she has been extensively written about by big names like Shakespeare, Chaucer, Boccaccio, some of the biggest names in Western literature ever. But who was this woman? Was she really this Machiavellian manipulator who seduced powerful men for her own political advantage? Why is she one of the only women in ancient history whose reputation still survives? We're going to be answering all this and more. And without any further ado, the life of Cleopatra. Hello everyone, I'm Eric Alden. Welcome to Biocast, a show that has one goal: understanding history one person at a time. Today, we're going to be exploring Cleopatra, someone who most Westerners think of as Caesar's lover, but the people living under her thought of her as Congress, a priestess, the president, the Pope, the Supreme Court, and a goddess, all wrapped up in one. It's going to be a very good episode. Today's show is brought to you by Biocast members on Patreon. Biocast is 100% free and 0% ads. Becoming a Biocast member means you get exclusive access to a bunch of additional content. So if you like this Cleopatra episode, there's going to be a lot more information you can get for just $10 a month. One is talking about Cleopatra's possible Myers-Briggs personality type. Another is an in-depth discussion about the Egyptian economy and how our perception of it has changed with time, and a whole lot more. So if this episode leaves you wanting more, be sure to become a member at patreon.com/biocast. You can find the link in the show notes or on the website biocast.xyz. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. Cleopatra may have been born into one of the most elitist, aristocratic families to have ever existed. The Ptolemaic elites control this entire kingdom of Egypt and use their political privilege to enrich themselves and expand their own influence. They controlled the entire nation for nearly 300 years, and in those 3 centuries, not a single one of the rulers even bothered to learn the language of the common people, Egyptian. At least, until Cleopatra came around. There was a big division between the Hellenic Greeks and Macedonians who ruled the country and the native Egyptian population. They didn't speak the same language, they didn't hang out in the same crowds, even had different laws to live by. The local Egyptians were basically second-class citizens in their own country. And the interesting thing about the Egyptians is that they took their religion very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that all the Ptolemaic monarchy really had to do to keep them at bay was incorporate this native folk religion into the way they ruled. Basically, just call themselves pharaohs and participate in the occasional religious festival. This elite family that controlled Egypt didn't actually think they were the pharaohs or the middleman between the ancient Egyptian gods and the everyday people. And this is something you see in politics a lot. Cynically and pragmatically playing the role that your subjects want you to play. It was never about anything more than power. This is how it was in Ptolemaic Egypt, and this is even the way it is today. There are plenty of American politicians who call themselves Christians and go to church every Sunday. It tricks gullible voters every single time. That's just how politics works. And these quote-unquote pharaohs could call themselves followers of Ra, Osiris, and Isis all they wanted. They didn't actually believe in any of it though. In fact, most of the Ptolemaic elite probably had contempt for this local folk religion. They were very ethnocentric, thought their Hellenic culture was superior to the Egyptian way of life. Then came Cleopatra, who must have been a breath of fresh air for the Egyptian population, at least in some ways. She was very much a ruler for the people, at least more so than any other pharaoh had been for centuries. And I would argue that the reason her legacy has survived is partly because she had this populist style of governing. She didn't just care about the aristocratic elite, she cared deeply about the concerns of the everyday Egyptian. It's very easy to leave a historical legacy behind when the average person feels like you had their best interests at heart when you were the ruler. And this is also true of Julius Caesar. The very first sentence in his Wikipedia article calls him a populist. And I know we have some political baggage with that word, but just keep in mind, it only means politicians who favor the common people over the elites. That's it. And with that definition, both Caesar and Cleopatra were the populists of the ancient world. And I'm sure you listening to this today can relate with this kind of leadership because, well, we live in a society where the elites do horrible stuff, get away with murder, steal tax dollars, jack up the price of life-saving medication, run private islands for unspeakable sex acts. And the elites, whoever they've been throughout human history, have always been doing this kind of stuff. It never changes. Two of the most popular political figures today, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, both are very anti-establishment, and that's not a fault, that's a feature. Neither of them would be popular if everyone thought they were part of the establishment. And the reason this whole populist element is so important for Cleopatra and Caesar is because it influences the way they behave in public and the kind of policies they create. Take away Cleopatra's popularity among her own people, and you have another forgotten Egyptian queen. Now, the only way you can rule people is by their consent. If enough of them want you out, you're gonna be taken out of power eventually. That's how government works. And Cleopatra's popularity with her own people was very much needed because, in more than one way, she was doing the exact same thing that her father got overthrown for doing. She was getting too close to Rome. If she was just another autocrat who never showed any particular interest in the people, she probably would have ended up just like her father, where he was forced into exile and almost killed by his own people at one point. I want to discuss the dynamic between Caesar and Cleopatra. There are many layers to this relationship, and so many different angles you can take. The relationship they had was very interesting, to say the least. And there can only ever be so much we know about the relationship. Remember, we only have ancient sources to rely on. There are no videos or pictures or anything objective like that. For all we know, the people who wrote the primary sources had bad information, or maybe Caesar and Cleopatra portrayed themselves in a certain way to advance their political situations. There could be any number of things that are downright false. Who knows? However, there are things we know for certain, like there was a 31-year difference between the two of them. Caesar was an old man. You've got to imagine this rough and gruff 50-year-old with a receding hairline who spent nearly his entire life on the battlefield, with this pristine, pampered 20-something coming from a life of luxury. Must have been an interesting sight. And they first meet when Cleopatra is in a little bit of trouble. You see, she and her brother, Ptolemy XIII, were fighting a brutal civil war. They both wanted power, both had claims to the throne, and those situations rarely end well. This also happened right around the time Caesar was taking over Rome. At this exact moment, he was chasing Pompey, who had been fleeing and hoped to take refuge in Egypt. It was one of the few places he could have been kept safe from Caesar's men. But Ptolemy knew that he needed Caesar on his side if he wanted to have the upper hand on Cleopatra. The Egyptian military was nothing compared to the Roman military, so whoever could win over Caesar was going to win big. Pompey sent out his messengers to Ptolemy. Ptolemy accepted, but when Pompey got there, he was brutally murdered by Ptolemy's men. Ptolemy knew that winning over Caesar would keep him safe and secure and in power, and he thought by killing Caesar's enemies, he could do that. He could win over Caesar. Boy, did that backfire. Pompey was literally beheaded, and his head was delivered directly to Caesar. But instead of being excited and happy about the situation, Caesar was disheartened. This was his former comrade after all. He didn't want to kill Pompey, just beat him in battle. The sight of the head brought Caesar to tears, and then he killed the assassins. Suffice to know, Caesar didn't particularly like Ptolemy after this, which made life a heck of a lot easier for Cleopatra. The second she got word that Caesar was in town, she was on her way to meet him. And let's not forget, they both had very different intentions with this relationship. Cleopatra was looking for political protection. If she didn't cozy up next to Caesar, her brother probably would have won the war. The same brother who was in control of the Egyptian capital, Alexandria. So Caesar's help was sorely needed. Cleopatra literally put herself into a rug that was smuggled into the palace where Caesar was staying. And this is something being done by a self-proclaimed goddess on earth, according to the ancient Egyptian religion of the time. This wasn't just a position of weakness, but one of complete desperation. Cleopatra's intentions, pretty clear. Caesar's, though, not so much. Many of the ancient sources, including Plutarch, make the situation out like this. Cleopatra uses her wit and charm to seduce Caesar for her own benefit, and Caesar takes the bait. He had much less to gain from any kind of relationship between the two of them, other than maybe sexual gratification or perhaps status. Let's not forget, Cleopatra is descended from one of Alexander the Great's best generals. By sleeping with Cleopatra and having a child with her, Caesar created a connection to Alexander the Great. But really, that's one of the only ways he could have benefited. And in all honesty, by this point in his career, his own reputation spoke for itself. He didn't need some loose connection to Alexander the Great. He was already the Caesar. A name that literally becomes a title in the Western world, like the German version Kaiser or the Slavic Tsar, and this survives 2,000 years. The last person whose title is derived from Caesar's name only got out of power in 1946. Plus, this title gets mentioned in the Bible. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So it's safe to say that Caesar probably wasn't after status. It could also be that he knew he just needed to pick either Ptolemy or Cleopatra, and it really didn't matter which one it was. So what starts out as a 50-50 turns in favor of Cleopatra when Ptolemy kills Pompey. It wasn't a tough choice for Caesar. Then you throw in his banana getting peeled by Cleopatra and, well, no wonder he picks her. In our modern society, relationships are pretty straightforward. That is, until children get involved. The second your relationship produces children, everything gets more complicated. It was kind of like that for Cleopatra and Caesar too, but in different ways. The child's name was Caesarion, which means Little Caesar, and no, this is not an ad for pizza. Caesar almost never publicly acknowledges the existence of his own kid. As far as Roman politics are concerned, he doesn't even have to exist. It doesn't matter if he does or not. But for Cleopatra, it changes a lot. This was one of the few Ptolemaic relationships that included someone outside of the family tree. Not only was this not the norm, but it completely violated tradition. This wasn't the first time it ever happened, but it wasn't supposed to. Now, part of the reason monarchies have done this incest thing is because it's very difficult allowing people into the family. You have a hereditary monarchy and control of an entire nation. You don't want to just let anyone into your family. Who your kids and grandkids marry literally changes the course of history. And as many of you know, you don't always pick the right person to marry. And picking the wrong person to marry when you're from a royal family, well, that could be the end of your dynasty if you don't control the situation. I mean, let's look at the other example. So, the first time an outsider ever married into the Ptolemaic monarchy was Cleopatra I. And for those of you a little confused right now, the Cleopatra we're discussing, the last and final Cleopatra, is the 7th. This royal family was notorious for unoriginal names. There are about 4 names that get consistently recycled, and Cleopatra is one of the 3 names a girl could get. Still not as bad as every male being named Ptolemy, but I digress. When Cleopatra I married into the royal family, she came from a nearby Hellenistic kingdom. This other place was the Seleucid Empire, and when Cleopatra I started having some political influence, she made deals and policies that favored this other kingdom. She still had loyalty there. In fact, the Egyptians were planning on fighting a war against the Seleucid Empire, and Cleopatra I steps in and was like, "Whoa, just take it easy, man." And that war never happened. You can only have loyalties to one nation. So you can really see why the monarchs were skeptical about letting outsiders into the royal family, and really, who wouldn't be? And as a side note, this is why just about every hereditary monarchy ever has practiced incest to some extent. It's the logical, yet kind of repulsive answer no one wants, but deserves. Practicing cannibalism when you run out of food, hiring a private eye to look into your shady spouse, that kind of thing. You don't want to do it, but you hate the alternative enough that you do it anyway. Let's get back to Caesarion for a minute. Caesar doesn't really tell the Romans about what happened. Again, doesn't really change anything for him. But Cleopatra made sure everyone knew her son's father was the one and only Caesar. Remember why she was with him in the first place. Political protection. No one could touch her so long as she had Caesar's protection, because Caesar's protection meant Rome wasn't going to attack. This situation is weird enough already, isn't it? But what if I also told you they were both married to other people during this whole fiasco? Cleopatra was officially married to her brother, the one that was trying to kill her. Interesting side note, they never officially got divorced, but Caesar eventually got him killed for Cleopatra, so it's all good, you don't need to divorce a dead spouse. After that, she was legally married to her much younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12 years old. Meanwhile, Caesar had a whole family back home. He'd gone through 3 official marriages in his life, and by the time he finds himself having an affair with Cleopatra, he was already on his 3rd wife, a nice Roman noblewoman named Calpurnia. This relationship would last until Caesar's assassination, despite him not being the most committed guy in the world. Around 46 BC, Cleopatra visited Rome and stayed in Caesar's house. Must have been a little awkward, seeing as the fact that his wife lived there, and here came the Egyptian goddess, who has a son with Caesar, staying for a short diplomacy visit like it's no big deal. And that's not the only interesting part, because Cleopatra also brought someone with her. Quote, "For she had come to the city with her own husband and settled in Caesar's own house, so that he too derived an ill reputation on account of both of them." Yikes. She stayed in Caesar's house, where his wife lived, and brought her own husband, who would have been her teenage younger brother at this point. Just imagine the kind of dinner conversations. I would pay a lot of money to be a fly on the wall in that house for a few days. "Hey, Cleopatra, how you been since we had that kid? This is my wife. She's really excited to meet you. Your husband brother is looking good. It looks like he hit puberty. Hey, sweetie, this is that Egyptian lady I nailed that I was telling you about." All jokes aside, this was such a strange situation. This relationship had a romantic element, sexuality was involved, politics, diplomacy. It's such an interesting dynamic, and if you'd like to hear more about it, there's an exclusive Biocast members-only video where we go a bit more in depth on it. But all in all, Caesar really didn't get anything tangible out of this relationship. She seduced him and used him as a pawn for her own protection. She was ruthless. But she wasn't just ruthless in the bedroom, she was like this in every aspect of her life. But mostly in politics. But what makes Cleopatra such a ruthless ruler is not that she was bloodthirsty, because she wasn't, at least by ancient standards. No, what makes her so ruthless is this cynical pragmatism that pervades every decision in her life, especially her politics. Let's look at an example that, on the surface, looks pretty good, until you see the strategic positioning behind it. The race issue. This was another of the many injustices of this ancient regime that Cleopatra inherited, and it was a pretty bad one. The local Egyptians were treated like second-class citizens in their own country. For one, there were 2 separate sets of laws, so if you were an Egyptian, you were living by a different set of laws than if you were a Greek, and these laws, they almost always favored the Greek. For example, if you were an Egyptian who tried leaving Alexandria without the state's approval, you had to pay 1/3 of all your net worth. Think how crippling that would be today if you tried leaving your city and the government told you that you had to pay 1/3. Contrast that with the Greek who just had to pay a small fine. And even worse, Greeks paid less in taxes despite making a heck of a lot more money. At one point during her reign, Cleopatra had to continuously deal with national disputes between citizens. Sometimes this took the form of someone pouring hot, boiling water on another. Sometimes this was just someone being randomly attacked. And almost always, it was an Egyptian attacking a Greek. There was a lot of resentment there, with almost no way to legally combat this inequality. So, many, understandably, turned to violence. Let's try to create a modern theoretical example here. As unlikely as it is to happen, imagine America gets invaded by the Chinese. They don't outright kill everyone, but they create their own system. A system where they control every industry, every major field, the entire political sphere, everything. The only jobs available to you, as an American, are rigorous manual labor. And then they place most of the tax burden for the entire country on you, even though you don't receive any of the benefits. Could you imagine how infuriating that would be? Forced into a second-class position in your own country, told that your way of life is inferior, living by strict, arbitrary rules where the wealth and productivity of your entire people group is outright stolen. This is a tough position to be in. You know you can't resist them. You're stuck in this horrible system that's arguably worse than slavery. And worst of all, you can't ever escape it. Where are you going to run to? Your nation is occupied. There's nowhere else to go. Resentment, hatred, agony. That's what the native Egyptians felt every single day for centuries. Now, do you understand why the Egyptians became so violent? Hostility to the Greeks wasn't undue bitterness, but vengeful violence. And make no mistake, the Egyptians got violent. One ancient Greek poet, Theocritus, described petty crime as mugging Egyptian style. But in all fairness, there is one very big however to this entire situation as well. It wasn't strictly ethnicity that determined your status. You could be 100% pure-blooded Egyptian, but if you somehow managed to become a teacher or an actor or found another influential position, you were considered Hellenic because you were spreading Hellenic culture. So if you had forsaken the traditions of your ancestors and family, became a supporter of the culture of your invaders, and somehow managed to find a decent job, then, and only then, could you be treated with the privilege of the upper class. I don't think that takes away from the suffering very much. After all, someone who went down that route is just a step away from Stockholm Syndrome. But it's only fair to mention it. But why is this important to Cleopatra? Because she used it to draw support from these local Egyptians, and she was able to do it with hardly any effort on her part. When she was fighting that civil war with her brother, most of the people joining her army and dying for her were these Egyptians. There was certainly a mix of different groups. One of them, surprisingly enough, were Jews. And it's really during the Civil War that she started doubling down as a populist, though her entire active political career was spent garnering as much support as humanly possible. And it goes back to her cynical pragmatism. She didn't actually want equality with the native Egyptians and the Hellenic people. She just wanted people like them to like her enough to die for her. That's what it was about all along. And really, let's set morality aside for a moment. This strategy of hers was just smart. Despite how she's portrayed in movies, Cleopatra was one of the most cunning ancient minds. She's extensively praised in Arabic texts, and Plutarch even claims that she was fluent in 9 different languages. Plus, she was well versed in science, medicine, philosophy, and probably a whole lot more. This intelligence comes in handy. Ancient politics has a lot less to do with ideology and everything to do with strategy. There are plenty of politicians today who deal with realpolitik as part of their job. Basically, realism as applied to politics. It may be part of politics today, but in Cleopatra's time, it was everything. There was almost no room for ideology. And if there was, it was occupied by religion. So this is the situation she's born into. She's one of 6 children born to Ptolemy XII. At one point in his career, Ptolemy XII gets exiled, and his eldest daughter, Berenice, takes control. She was around 20 years old. Well, he eventually comes back and, as any loving parent would do, executes her. So that leaves Cleopatra in a death struggle with her brother, Ptolemy XIII. The other children, they didn't really matter. Only a few years go by before Ptolemy XII dies, and writing in his will that he wants Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to rule jointly. He wants them to work together. He didn't want any more family having to kill family. And right when he dies, that's when Cleopatra quickly moves to put herself in power. She traveled to a nearby city to be part of an Egyptian religious ceremony. It was a real struggle getting there, seeing as this other city was over 400 miles up the Nile River. But the trip was worth it because it allowed Cleopatra to make a good impression on the Egyptian people. After her father's death, she made this public appearance which kind of insinuated that she's the next in command and the current ruler, not her brother. The ceremony also had to deal with deifying a bull in the name of the god of war, Montu. Don't forget religions of the utmost importance during this time. So being there for part of this really looks good on her. All around, a very smart move on Cleopatra's part. This is a perfect illustration of how seriously she took the religious traditions. Her priority was the survival of her reign, which meant that she needed the high priests on her side. Another example of how she basically exploited this religion was the burial of the Apis bull in 50 BC. She was arguably one of the most religiously involved monarchs of the entire regime, which gave her a lot of power over her own people. But as much as she made an attempt to ensure her own rule, she inherited a lot of problems. So many problems, in fact, this would be known as a period of chaos in Egyptian history. Ancient sources use the term anarchia, which is the root of our word for anarchy. And really, it's not a bad way to describe what's going on. The farming was less than usual, leaving the Egyptian farmers with significantly less crops than usual. This caused food shortages, which eventually turned into riots in the capital of Alexandria. And if the important people in Alexandria aren't getting their food, there's a lot of neighboring villages and smaller cities that aren't getting food either. Plus, there is a 17.5 million drachmas that she owes to Rome. Not a very good time to inherit the leadership, but power always comes with a price, I suppose. Speaking of Rome, she was in a really tricky position with what happened to the governor of Syria. Syria, as you know, was a Roman province during this time, and the governor was a man named Bibulus. He wasn't particularly powerful or smart, but he did his job well enough. Things turned bad though, and when I say bad, I mean really bad. Picture this. A bunch of former Roman soldiers, a bunch of these big, muscular, warrior, ferocious guys, they all settle down in Egypt. They're a little rambunctious. They're noted for their lawlessness, infamous for it, in fact, but they don't pose too much of a geopolitical problem. There aren't too many of them. But things turn for the worse when they go over to Syria, find the two sons of Bibulus, and then proceed to torture and kill them. This put Cleopatra in a real bind, because understandably, Rome was not happy. And when your citizens commit a crime, it's very easy to blame your government as a whole for being complacent. I mean, these people were under her jurisdiction, and there are even historical rumors that the Egyptian government even encouraged this. Maybe was even complacent, like Rome suspected. Long and short of it, Cleopatra gets the blame. She goes into crisis management mode. Remember, all Rome needs is a solid excuse to invade. Cleopatra can kiss her power goodbye. So she kicks it into high gear, tracks down the killers, and sends them to Bibulus for punishment. But he sends them back. Despite whatever emotions he may have been feeling, he knew that he needed to operate with the Roman Senate's approval before issuing any kind of punishment on them. Even if her gesture wasn't appreciated, it underlines how seriously she took relations with Rome. It was a close one, but luckily enough, Rome wasn't feeling like they wanted to invade Egypt at this very moment, so she lucked out. Power was safe for the moment. And historically speaking, there's a lot of inherent risk when living inside the Roman sphere of influence. It wasn't long after this little event here that Caesar made his way to Egypt, giving Cleopatra the opportunity she needed to consolidate power over her brother and security from Rome. But I think a really good way to get an understanding of the geopolitical situation she inherited is by looking at the Ptolemaic regime in general and how it historically dealt with the Romans. Cleopatra was inheriting a very difficult role historically speaking. Rome was in its phase of growth where it just wanted more land, more money, more people, more power. But you get a good idea of the situation by looking at how her father handled the Romans. And I'm not sure handled is the right word. I think a better way to put it is he subjugated himself to Rome. He was in a position where Rome controlled every single territory around Egypt, even on the southeastern border, and the only reason Egypt itself was independent was because the Ptolemaic monarchs were able to buy off Roman politicians when they needed to. It also helps that the Nile was the breadbasket of the world, so these Ptolemaic monarchs had an extremely easy time getting wealthy. And that's exactly what her father did. He basically used the wealth generated from the Nile to buy off Rome. For generations, these monarchs were stuck in the situation of giving Rome money in the hopes it would buy their autonomy. Hey guys, I know you could totally invade our nation and kill all our people and then start using the Nile for your own benefit, especially because you literally control all the land around us with an army that's way more experienced and larger, but please don't because here, have some money. This is just how geopolitics work when you're a smaller country with no allies to defend you. This was a case of political extortion. And not only was it a bad move politically putting yourself in this position of constant appeasement, but it was also bad on the home front. Think about how the Egyptian population would have reacted. Now, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of civil strife in Egypt where there were a bunch of people who were second-class citizens and unjust laws and a horrible bureaucracy, but despite the problems with the government, the Egyptians did not like seeing their government bend the knee. And maybe that's a universal. No one wants to see the government they live under kowtow to a superior power. It's painful, and in more than just one way. Let's make a comparison here. Imagine you're the president of Belgium during World War I. You know that Germany is going to try to get through your country and invade France at any moment. You know that your population is way too small to make a difference. The size of the German military is nearly half the population of your entire country. There's no way you're going to stand even the slightest chance. So when Germany starts crossing the border without your permission, what are you going to do? Do you kowtow and submit and allow these invaders to march through your nation without any resistance? Do you stand and fight, if not to win, if only to protect your honor? If you're a Belgian citizen, you want to fight. Sure, you might be drafted or attacked or killed or whatever other horrible thing that happens during wartime. But knowing that your country resisted is very important. Imagine your government lets them go through without having any trouble. That's cause for outrage. Even if you know that you're going to lose, you want to fight. It's human nature, and when Rome was starting to expand just a little bit too close to Egyptian borders, you can bet the Egyptian people were not too friendly of the relations with the Romans. An Eastern monarch who waged his own battle against Rome described Cleopatra's predicament like this. The Romans had the temperament of wolves. They hated the great kings. Everything they possessed, they had plundered. They intended to seize all and would either destroy everything or perish in the attempt. And this wasn't just true in Cleopatra's time, but had been the case for many, many years. Her father was in a particularly difficult position because Rome really wanted to invade Egypt when he was the ruler. Not for any particular reason, but every now and again, Rome decides that it needs more wealth or more land or whatever else. And despite how much money he had given the Romans, they still had a lot of contempt for him. They called him Ptolemy the 12th Alatus, which translates into something like the flute player or piper. It wasn't looked upon as a positive trait either. There was this underlying insinuation that instead of pursuing knowledge and politics and diplomacy and whatever else, you were sitting around playing a flute. But as much contempt as the Romans had for Ptolemy the 12th, they didn't invade. That wasn't the issue Ptolemy had to worry about though, because his own people overthrew him, took him out of power. When Cleopatra was about 10 years old, a disastrous geopolitical dumpster fire started. Rome took control of the island of Cyprus, which had previously belonged to Egypt. This was a massive blow to the Egyptian psyche, so much so that Ptolemy's brother committed suicide. And unsure of how to handle the situation, he didn't say anything about his brother's apparent suicide to the Egyptian public. He just kinda brushed it off and went on with life. Rome was directly responsible for his brother's death, and he didn't do anything about it. Plus, he had to implement an even heavier tax burden on the Egyptian public to be able to fund all the tribute to send to Rome. This was not looking good. Rome was taking Egyptian land, causing chaos in Egypt, and they were getting rewarded for it. Let's bring it back to our Belgium-Germany comparison. Germany slowly but surely starts creeping onto Belgian territory, and it's distressing enough that the president's own brother kills himself. And then the president starts sending even more money to Germany. And he's gonna tax you to do it. Would you want a president like that ruling your country? And if we're gonna be honest here, none of us can really fault you for overthrowing a president like that. Ptolemy XII was typical of the late Ptolemaic monarchs, at least in the sense that he was ineffective and did not deserve to be in power. If he hadn't inherited the throne, he never would have been in any position of power, ever. The only politically noteworthy thing he ever accomplished was securing Egypt from a Roman invasion, but again, he did it at a substantial cost. And while he was in exile in Rome, his daughter Berenice took power in his absence. He was gone for 3 entire years, and the worst part was that his daughter had legitimacy amongst the Egyptian people. Luckily for him though, Rome decided that it was easier to put him back into power than it was to buy her off. The Romans funded his military and gave him a bunch of troops and installed him as the pharaoh like the good puppet that he was. I cannot imagine this helped his public reputation amongst the Egyptian people very much. He was already viewed as a Roman puppet who betrayed his own people, and now he killed a legitimate ruler who had popular support with the help of a foreign nation. If people were suspicious that he was a traitor before, their suspicions were confirmed now. And this leads him to write in his will and testament that his children will be joint rulers with equal power. Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 13th. You know, the ones that fight that brutal civil war we were just talking about. And as you can see with Ptolemy XII, having Roman support was everything. Cleopatra was smart to learn from her father's example. But let's transition here and take a look at the economy that kept them in power. It's always difficult getting a grasp of ancient economies. Sometimes just going back 100 years and understanding that economy can be a challenge. Hell, even understanding our own economy can be tricky. But going back 2,000 years is a whole new layer of difficulty. What we can say for sure though is that Egypt was one of the most economically advanced regions of the world. If you've ever seen a map of ancient Rome at its peak, you understand how much land and how many people are under the control of this massive empire. But to give you some numbers here, it controlled 2.2 million square miles and had 60 million citizens and roughly 120 million people living within those borders. And out of all that land and all those people, the most economically successful outside of Rome was Egypt. And let's not forget, the reason Rome was so wealthy was because that's where all the stolen wealth and treasure ended up. Not because it was prosperous on its own merit, but because that's where the power was. It's interesting to contrast ancient Egypt with Egypt today, because Egypt today is a fairly poor country with low economic development, not a lot of influence on the world stage, but ancient Egypt was so prosperous that it was oftentimes called the breadbasket of the world. It was the most fertile land someone could ever ask for. Herodotus literally thought they grew crops without any work. Even if that's an exaggeration, it's not a very big one. Everywhere was depending upon Egypt for food and other kinds of crops that could only grow near the Nile River. But if you want to get a good idea of the way this economy operated, I think the best comparison you can make is that of the Soviet Union. I know that may come as a shock, but it's the most accurate comparison you can make. The Egyptian economy was almost completely controlled by the state. There was no free market. For every crop and business and transaction, there was a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy and state officials who had to come in and inspect everything. For example, if you wanted to chop down a tree, breed pigs, or turn your barley fields into an olive garden, you needed the government's approval. And let's not forget, this is before the internet or cell phones. Getting the government to come and inspect that horrible dead tree on your land could take months. Ptolemaic Egypt was great at keeping an accurate population census, even on slaves, because you had to pay tax on everything. Personal income tax, tax for children, slave tax, everything. There was one message the government continuously used to reassure the population. Quote, "Nobody is allowed to do what he wishes, but that everything is arranged for the best." Yeah, I guess you could say they had a little bit of an authoritarian touch to their style of governing. Everything was heavily taxed, and this all raked in crazy profits for Cleopatra. The rest of the country, not so much. Now, it's only honest to mention that this idea of a powerful, bureaucratic state has been challenged by newer historians who argue that this was an exaggeration and the state didn't control nearly as much as people had previously claimed. This is part of a long historical debate. If you're interested in that discussion, there's an additional video you can have access to if you're a Biocast member. But the long and short of it is that the government had a strong say over the economy, but it was poorly organized and not well thought out. There was definitely a lot of bureaucracy, but it was like inefficient bureaucracy. No one really knew what they were doing, and there was no clear line of delineation, like one person's job sometimes crossed paths with another person's job, and they would sometimes fight about what they were doing. The best way you can visualize this regime is as a bunch of friends of the monarch doing everything they can to extract the maximum amount of wealth from the subjects while trying to prevent a revolution. And boy, did these people have cause for a revolution. This government was horrible, even keeping profitable industries all to itself. The biggest industries such as wheat, glass, papyrus, they were all essentially royal monopolies. And the worst part was the corruption by royal officials, because if you were one of those people, you could operate without paying tax, without worrying about any of the bureaucracy, and it gave you an insane amount of leverage over all the peasants who did have to deal with that stuff. Imagine you have two businesses side by side. One of them has to pay tax on every transaction and needs to abide by very strict regulations, and the other doesn't. Which one do you think is going to be more profitable in the long run? So even when the government wasn't directly stealing from the Egyptian people, they were quietly stealing from the Egyptian people. One of the few redeeming qualities of this government is that it was very protectionist economically speaking. It wanted to ensure that Egyptian business, whether it was run by individuals or the state, had advantages over international business. They didn't want big business from Rome coming in and monopolizing everything. And a really interesting subject to study is the demographics of Ptolemaic Egypt, because it's just not what you would expect. The big ancient cities, particularly Alexandria and Ptolemais, were very, very metropolitan. Not only were there Hellenic Greeks and Macedonians, but there were many Jews who settled in this region around this time. And for those of you wondering, this is centuries after the Exodus event when the Jews were freed from Egyptian slavery. It's also a completely different regime in control, one that was much more willing to allow Jews to settle down and integrate, so long as they could benefit, of course. Cleopatra personally had good relations with the Jewish community, building temples and whatnot. Despite there being all of these different groups, Jews, Hellenics, Egyptians, and other minority ethnic groups like Nubians and Syrians, they were most likely highly segregated. So there's this modern example where just about every multicultural city today kind of follows that pattern, even places like New York City. But there's also archaeological evidence to suggest that these ancient groups, they just really stuck to themselves. Maybe self-segregation is human nature, perhaps? Another interesting find is that the native Egyptians dominated the rural communities. There was almost no one else in the small town Ptolemaic Egypt. The cities were these multicultural, metropolitan hotspots, but everywhere else, native Egyptians. Again, kind of follows a similar pattern to modern civilization. Go to any major American city and you find just about any ethnicity, religion, or language in the world. Small town America, though, not so much. And something that's very unique to Hellenic kingdoms in general is that they were fairly accepting of other people groups so long as those people groups conformed to Hellenic culture. At least in comparison to most other cultures, it was fairly easy to integrate to. And all of this really goes back to the beginning of Hellenic culture and how it spread. Let's go back to the very beginning of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Alexander the Great conquers all of the known world. Then he dies at the ripe old age of 33, leaving 5.2 million square miles of unruled land. It was eventually divided between 4 of his best generals. Egypt was given to Ptolemy, who set the framework for how the government would operate. He had a unique problem because he had to reconcile the culture of his own people, the Hellenics, and the culture of the local Egyptian population. Instead of outright dominating the Egyptians, he sought to establish a monarchy as a bridge between the local Egyptian people and as a legitimate Hellenic monarch at the same time. This was a very smart move. He avoided years of conflict, turmoil, revolution. This was also one of the first examples of diversity playing any major role in an ancient state. Another really interesting point I'd like to hit on is the religiosity of the Egyptian population. I've been making note of this element throughout this episode, but there is one specific event that I think paints a really fascinating yet morbid picture of how seriously the Egyptians took their religion. So, before I tell you this incident, I have to remind you that this was less of a religion in the modern way we think about it. What most ancient people practiced was a lot closer to something of a freaky animal-worshipping cult than it was anything resembling a modern religion. They were pretty nuts. That's not to say their Roman or Etruscan or Carthaginian counterparts were any less crazy with their religions, but this is how important cats were, for example, in Ptolemaic Egypt. The historian Diodorus, who visited Egypt this one time, witnessed a riot and lynching that occurred when someone accidentally committed the sacrilege of killing a cat. An incident that was notable for the failure of government officials sent to the scene to intervene. Accidentally killing a cat got you lynched. Just think about that for a moment. That's a kind of religious extremism that makes medieval Europe look easygoing, and boy is that saying something. The Egyptians were a gifted people in many ways. One of the things they did better than anyone else was copy other people, literally stealing the enemy's tactics and using it against them. There was one Roman general who later recounted how they, quote, put into effect whatever they saw us do with such skill that it seemed our troops had imitated their work. Pretty smart. If you can't beat 'em, copy 'em. Makes sense to me. The Egyptians who were fighting under Ptolemy XIII when Caesar invaded even used this tactic against him, and it was actually pretty effective. Not enough to beat Caesar, but they held their own. But let's get back to Cleopatra for a moment. When Caesar was assassinated, she was in a serious bind. Caesar was the one person protecting Egypt from Roman annexation, so only a few years later, she hooks up with the next Roman political hotshot, Mark Antony. Now, the first time Cleopatra meets Mark Antony, she puts on this lavish display. She arrived on a golden barge with purple sails with rows of silver oars. It was even more lavish than the show she put on for Caesar. And luckily for her, Mark Antony is the kind of guy that had a large sexual appetite. He liked women. Let's leave it at that. This left him very vulnerable to exploitation by someone like Cleopatra. But here was the tricky part about siding with Antony. He was only one of 3 military dictators during this time, and think back to what happened during the last triumvirate. They all turned on each other and fought wars against each other. It was a period of absolute chaos. And unfortunately, history is going to repeat itself. And Cleopatra was in a bit of a bind because she picked the wrong member of the second triumvirate. The most powerful one, Octavian, he was unstoppable. It wasn't long after they started the second triumvirate that Octavian was plotting against Mark Antony. There was some difficulty at first, but he found success in exposing Antony's love life to the Roman Senate. Octavian showed the Roman Senate that Antony had left all of his wealth to his children by Cleopatra. It's also important to point out that Mark Antony was married to Octavian's sister, Octavia, so it was a little personal too. Octavian began a massive propaganda campaign against Cleopatra to start a war. He needed the Roman Senate to approve, and so he went to work spreading rumors about Cleopatra. And the worst part is, it goes to show Octavian's ruthlessness. Cleopatra tried to politically align herself with the entirety of the second triumvirate. But Octavian knew the only way he could get Rome to turn against Antony was to turn Rome against Cleopatra. And that's exactly what he did. And something you really need to understand for the context of this situation is that Octavian was trying to frame himself as Caesar's heir, his successor, the next in line. I mean, legally speaking, he was Caesar's adopted son. Caesar did not have any legitimate living children under Roman law, and so he adopted Octavian as the primary heir. But his legitimacy was under attack when Antony said that Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, was Caesar's true heir. He said this to the Roman Senate. Start attacking someone's political legitimacy, and you're really asking for the horns. And oh boy, did he get them. Tensions were getting really bad. Antony was spending most of his time in Egypt. Octavian was continuously spreading propaganda against him and Cleopatra. Octavian eventually got through to the Roman Senate, and they issued a declaration of war against Cleopatra with the understanding that by doing this, they were really declaring war on Mark Antony. This all culminated in the Battle of Actium on the Ionian Sea. Cleopatra and Antony got together all the men they could to fight Rome. But it just wasn't enough, especially because they were using merchant fleets and other untrained forces in their military. Octavian was fighting with an experienced and well-disciplined force. And as the war raged on, Antony and Cleopatra fled the battle knowing they were going to lose. This made things even worse, where hundreds of officers and troops were defecting to Octavian's side. So even if they had a slim chance in the beginning, by not being there to support the troops' morale, they doomed themselves. Now, Cleopatra was unsure of what to do next. Her and Mark Antony had something of a falling out. They just weren't feeling the love anymore, understandably so considering how things went down. And now she was on the run from Rome. Things were just not looking good. And this is how desperate she got. She began hiding out in her tomb and sent a message to Mark Antony that she'd committed suicide. And really, this is one of those things that I have a really hard time understanding. Why did she do this? Maybe she just wanted to see how he would react, but I'm not sure she was expecting what actually happened, because upon hearing the news, Antony stabbed himself in the stomach, committed suicide. Octavian quickly took control of Alexandria and found Cleopatra in her tomb. Now, in the circumstance of being defeated, Cleopatra didn't mind being beaten by Rome, but she did not want to be paraded around Rome in disgrace, because what Romans had a tendency of doing was defeating their enemies, not killing them, but bringing them back to Rome to parade them around and humiliate them in front of a crowd, which is a little twisted in its own way. Instead of allowing herself to be degraded like that, she thought suicide was a better route, and it gets a little tricky because no one agrees on the exact way she kills herself. Some of the ancient sources claimed that she allowed a snake to bite her, others claimed that she used some kind of ointment, another claims that she injected herself with a poison needle. We don't really know for sure, but what we do know is that she killed herself to avoid this humiliation. And that was the end of her reign. Octavian would kill Caesarion, and the rest of Cleopatra's children would be sent off to Rome. The Ptolemaic kingdom came to an end, and Egypt became a Roman province. And that is going to be it for the life of Cleopatra. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you're just dying for more, you can get a whole bunch of exclusive content for just $10 a month. Become a Biocast member today and you'll get exclusive presentations, videos, audio projects, and a whole bunch more. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can go to patreon.com/biocast. This has been Eric Alden. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.